Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Tran. For those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet yet, it is so wonderful to be able to start off the day with everyone here. I've been excited and looking forward to this workshop that's going to be presented by Amy Michael and Jamae Marsh. I am the capacity building consultant for COO, and for those who might be less familiar with Communities of Opportunity, it's an initiative that started in 2014 between the Seattle Foundation and King County, with community at the center, really focused on figuring out how we can help to advance racial equity and more equitable community conditions through the incredible work that you all are doing on the ground. And so as a part of that is trying to provide different types of learning resources and workshops and trainings where different skill or knowledge areas that you all have been asking for deeper learning in is brought into the space alongside all of your own brilliance and knowledge and experiences. This is definitely a co-created space and one that we're really honored to have you be a part of. So with that, I will, with joy, hand it off to Amy to get us started. And also want to acknowledge that we have Caroline Burney from our COO administrative team helping to provide logistical support and tech support today. So Caroline's there. If you all need any support from her, please just feel free to send her a message on the chat. But big thank you to Caroline as well. So with that, I'll hand it to Amy.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm delighted to be here. I also want to reiterate, thank you, Caroline, for making this a seamless process to participate in. Well, welcome to a conversation about financial planning for a sustainable future. I will bring up a slideshow in a minute, but I wanted to spend some time so we could see each other's faces. I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to surprise Jamae and ask them to introduce themselves, and then we'll hop into the presentation. I'm Amy. I've known Sarah Tran for many years and have really enjoyed working with her. I've been working with Communities of Opportunity for the last year and feeling incredibly privileged to do that. I've been doing number stuff all of my career, mostly in the nonprofit sector, sometimes in the for-profit sector. I love numbers and I also love people. And so talking with folks about how do we break down some of these barriers around financial matters and money matters. You know, I feel like there's a lot of systemic oppression and racism built into the systems that I have worked in all of my life. And so my joy in doing this work is working with folks and tearing those down and leveraging my privilege in that area that's steeped in that language of finance to tear it down brick by brick. Let's all get in there and talk about this stuff together. So I'm really honored that you all showed up and that I can be here in community with all of you. Jamae, I'm so excited that you're here. I am such a fan of Feast, looking forward to the event coming up, and such a fan of Jamae. Would you say a few words about you?
Thanks so much. What a good morning to be here with y'all. My name's Jamae Marsh. I use they, them pronouns. I'm executive director of Feast, and I've had the great honor and pleasure of working with Sarah and working with Amy. Sarah is my coach, and Amy has been a great financial coach to me, and we've worked together on a multi-year budgeting tool that will probably be discussed throughout this workshop. Feast is funded by Communities of Opportunity, so very grateful for that. And just excited to be here and share some of our experience today.
Thanks. All right, let's dive in. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen? The big green egg. Awesome. Okay. Cool. Okay, so today we're going to talk about financial planning for a sustainable future. It's got my name and then Jamae's name comes up. Oops, unintentional animation. Sarah already went through this, but so grateful to Communities of Opportunity for creating this space and this time for us. And we already did introductions too. Great. It would be awesome if all of you could put your name in the chat and introduce yourself in any way that strikes you this morning. A couple suggestions up there, a question or a learning goal you're hoping to get out of today, maybe your organization. And then as we go through this morning, we've got a great size group for just really making this as conversational as possible. I think there's so much wisdom in the room, and sharing with each other can be such a great way to really improve the outcomes for the whole workshop for all of us. So ask questions as we go. If you want to use the chat, great. I'm going to try to keep an eye on it. Sarah and Jemay, I'm sure will keep an eye on it too. If you want to just speak up and come off mute, you're welcome to do that too. Okay. And yay, thank you all for being here. We got Choose 180 in the room. We got Feast in the room. Letty from SVP Seattle, Sammy. Oh my goodness. Great organizations, really cool people. Lika from Union Cultural Center. Neat. Keep them coming. All right, so let's talk about our learning objectives that we're gonna focus on today. The first one is that we're gonna look at identifying ways of improving the operational and strategic relevance of our planning processes. A lot of times we focus on budget and planning as a governance piece, something the board needs, something grantors need. And today we're gonna really focus on how does this process really serve us in our work. And then we're going to work to deepen our understanding of how participatory planning could go or expand at our organizations. And then we're also going to develop some ideas for how to have tough planning conversations with our board of directors. We all have experience with this over the last few years. There have been a lot of tough and unclear conversations that we've had to have. So this would be a great opportunity, I think, for us to share some of those stories from the field. And then also I'll show you some tools. You'll get tools emailed to you too for participating in the workshop, PDF and Excel versions. Just some ideas that we've pulled together about how you can take back to your organizations and put some of these ideas into practice. And so the questions that we use to frame the ideas for today are, how do we plan while the future is uncertain, which is something that for sure has been on our minds both during the pandemic and now as we are sort of emerging from the pandemic. We still have a great deal of uncertainty we're dealing with. How do we decide who should be driving the planning process and who should be participating in the planning process? And how do I talk with my board when my budget isn't breaking even or there's other tough conversations to be had? All right, so we'll just jump right in, and just to get our, yes, this information will be shared with you. You will get a PDF of the slide deck, and you'll get either maybe one or both. Caroline, maybe just send both the Excel and the PDF of the tool attachments, but yes, get everything. Okay, so since your fingers are all warmed up in the chat box, let's just start out by kind of naming some of those uncertainties that our organizations have faced, or we've heard other organizations are facing in the last few years. I put pandemic out there as one, and feel free to get more specific with that. If anyone would like to come off mute and just speak up instead of chatting, great. Sarah, Jemay, if you want to toss anything in there, that's great too. So what kind of uncertainties are we facing, or have we been facing when it comes to planning in our organizations? The big tricky ones. Maybe it's too tough a question for first thing in the morning. Changing needs based on moving to virtual work. That is such a significant one that lots of folks are facing for sure. What else are some of the uncertainties we have to plan for?
May also added, will or how will the economic downturn affect income?
Right. Oh, thanks for catching that. Yeah. Yes, the economic downturn, inflation, yeah, how will that affect our resources and giving? Emergency housing. Will funds continue to still be available once the fear of the pandemic has passed? Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of, feels like we're all dealing with a lot of uncertainty around funding for sure. Reprioritizing our work. Yeah. Is now a good time to grow staff to meet needs? Excellent. I think one of the things I hear from a lot of organizations I work with is the challenge in hiring, and the way the job market is right now and the way our salaries are right now. If we can't staff up, we can't do the work that we want to do, and it's hard to plan when we don't know how many resources we're going to have. Great. Well, thanks everybody for sharing, and I'm sure we could go on and on with this. There are a lot of uncertainties for sure, but I think we've hit on some of the really big ones. Thanks for sharing that. So one of the things, so I'm a big fan of planning. I'm just going to out myself right now. I like finance, and if you came to last finance reporting workshop, hopefully you got that enthusiasm there too. Planning to me, though, is one of the tools that we get to use in our organizations that can really work towards democratizing or tearing down some of the hierarchical decision making in our organizations. And it's really an opportunity to engage our board and bring our board along on that journey of how decision making is made in our organizations. So this is why I get this, to me, is where finance, budgeting, and planning also almost get into an activism space really inside of our organizations. That said, it's not easy. It takes time, it takes money, it takes people being willing. And those are not things we have in excess in our organizations. So one of the things when I love working with organizations on budgeting and planning. I also get to teach organization planning and finance to nonprofit leaders over at Seattle U. So I spent a lot of time thinking about, excuse me, best practices and that too. So sometimes I do approach things from sort of that wishful level of like, well, it could be like this. So forgive me, that's my teacher hat on. So the first thing I think about when I think about budgeting is that we start big picture and then we move to the details. And so that means we really have to know where we are now, where we've come from, and where we want to go, both in the near term and then the longer term. And we have to have a concept of how we're going to get there. And then we have to really be honest with ourselves about what we know and what we don't know. Sometimes there's a lot of fear around the budgeting process or anxiety because it's hard to predict what the future is. And there's a lot riding on those predictions. People's jobs, the success of the organization, the board's confidence in us. So it's totally normal to have that anxiety. But when we acknowledge to ourselves, like, you know what, we're just guessing and life comes up. So really understanding like, hey, this is the stuff I'm pretty certain about. And these are the factors that are going to impact it that I'm like, I don't know, 50-50 chance. That can really reduce the level of anxiety around planning when we just acknowledge that piece. All right, so this, thinking about this big picture, starting with the big picture of our organization, it's different at every organization. We're all at different points in time in our growth and our development, adding programs, eliminating programs, getting new funding, trying to get rid of certain kinds of funding. And these kinds of big story parts are not always what's in our mission statement or our purpose statement. They're not always what's in our strategic goals, because those all have a certain audience and a certain purpose. So I want to think about the story for our budget as a little bit different, or a story for planning a little bit differently than those two things. So for example, I've worked with some organizations that are getting considerably more public funding than they've been getting before. I mean, government funding here. And so that's really influencing the way forward. That's not necessarily in their purpose statement or in their strategic goals, like, let's get more federal funding, but it's a really big part of the story for their organization. I've also worked with organizations that are trying to move away from some of that government funding and move towards more private fundraising. That also might not make it into your strategic plan, but it's a really big influencer of how your budget's going to go. So I want to take a few minutes And we're gonna do breakouts. Caroline is going to help us because she's fantastic. And I want us to, so we're gonna break out into groups of 3. We're gonna take 10 minutes to think through. You can take some silent time first too, to think about what is the headline story or the big story at our organizations, both this year that we're in right now, and then whatever your next planning year is, whether that starts January, July, September, whatever. And what we're looking for in the story is those influencing factors. So sometimes I like to think about them as guardrails. Like, well, we could do all kinds of planning, right? But we want to do it down this road that's got as many lanes as we need. And so what are those influencing factors? Some of them might be limiting factors, and some of them might be expansive factors. And so take some time to come up with 2 or 3 sentences that describe your the story of your organization. And then we'll come back and we're going to share headlines if you want to, but more, how did that process feel for you and what surprised you or what did you learn? So Caroline, do you mind there we go. All right, we'll see you back here in 10.
Great.
Hi, you want to be in a room?
Yeah. No, I asked Caroline not to add me.
Oh, okay.
Thanks.
Got it.
Hi,
Kai,
Amy. I'm Kai.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't think you two have had a chance to meet yet. So Kai is one of the COO staff team and leads up the entire kind of learning community, which the capacity building is a part of where this capacity building work. So yeah,
Oh, well,
you came to learn today.
I did. I came to learn.
Yay. Well, thanks for joining today.
Yeah,
Nice
thank
to meet
you. I appreciate that it's, I mean, you know, I have to deal with budgets too, and there's like uncertainty in our budgets. And so
Welcome back, everyone.
Cool. Folks are coming back. Welcome back to the big room. Oh, I don't need that. I see. All right. Let's see. Is everyone back? It's so hard for me to see things. No, it looks like we still got some few seconds left. I could sing the Jeopardy theme. That would be then recorded. So no, just wait. Cool. Well, I cannot wait to hear how that conversation went for folks.
Samira is already putting something into the chat. Or maybe that's, yeah, right now. Just great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for participating in the breakout rooms, and hope you had some good conversations and learned something about each other and each other's organizations. So I'd love to hear from a couple folks in the chat or out loud about how was that process for you. If you want to share your headline story, because it's cool, you're absolutely welcome to do that. And also looking for just how the process was for you. Was it hard? Was it easy? Do you feel like you've got to the meat of what's impacting your planning? Jump right in. Samira shared something that I've noticed is getting individual donations is based on relationship building, which has totally shifted because of the pandemic. Right. That's such a great thing to say out loud about planning, that relationship building looks different and that we can't pivot on a dime necessarily on that, although I imagine your organizations have. And so we have to learn how to, Samira says, to be creative on how to reach out and build connections to secure funding while respecting people's boundaries and concerns about COVID. Yeah, outdoor events. It was nice to hear where other organizations are at and how funding has changed during the pandemic and what that means for our future planning. That's great. That's great. I mean, one of the opportunities we have here today, in that this is like, this is a place where we can talk about the great stuff and also the stuff that scares us. There's no judgment in this room, is to really understand that, like, there's so much richness in sharing the hard stuff and the easy stuff. We learn so much from each other. So I'm really glad people are able to share those stories. Anyone else have anything they want to share about their headline stories?
I can just share a little bit. So my headline is that we're a brand new nonprofit and I'm a new executive director. And so those are some of the guardrails too. I mean, it's kind of all one. But I was appreciating being reminded in our group that there's also a lot of opportunity in that, and that we can really think to define how we want to do things and in the midst of facing that uncertainty. So just kind of trying to be reminded to stay optimistic about it, even if it feels kind of daunting at times. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, we'll actually talk about, and I'll share an anonymous story about another organization I've worked with that's also brand new and the challenges that brings for budgeting and having that conversation with your board a little bit later. Thanks for sharing that, Jody. Also, let's see. So someone has shared this process has brought up more questions for me, and I'm thinking more about how important it is to directly communicate my concerns and perspectives with my board. No sugarcoating needed. I love that. Yeah, this headline story can actually turn out to be, the first slide in your presentation, or, a note somewhere in your budget presentation or conversation with your board, which is, hey, we could dive right into the numbers, but really let's talk about what the factors are that are impacting the way we're doing our planning next year and maybe beyond. So thank you so much, Crystal. That's excellent. Anyone else want to share before we move on? Oh, we've got one more here. Looking at a funding gap this year with a lot of focus of our development team on closing the gap. I'd already like to be looking 2 to 3 years out. I think that's such an excellent point too. One of the downfalls of the annual budget process is that it puts us in this just very narrow vision of 1 year ahead. And what we know is true in our work is there is no start stop in January, December. I mean, there might be some campaign stuff, but ultimately, when we're talking about adding new programs or shifting programs, we're talking about a multi-year process. When we're talking about rebuilding a fundraising department, or starting a new fundraising plan or building relationships, we all know those take years too. And so multi-year planning, and Janae will talk, I think, about that. I'll talk about that. Janae and I will talk about that together. Multi-year planning is also a way to broach this conversation with your board. So you may have a year coming up where there's going to be a deficit, maybe some CARES Act funding's ending. We've got some new ideas about how we're going to deliver services, and it's going to take us a while to backfill that funding. And here's why we don't want you to worry about it, because we got some surplus maybe from last year. And here's how we see this coming out in year 2 and 3 to come back to a sustainable organization. And if we don't, here's some levers we can pull, so that can be a great way to frame a tough budget conversation with the board. Boards also tend to be very annual budget is a deficit. Who cares? We made $2 million extra last year and it's in the bank. Yes, I'd like to shift the process to multi-year planning instead of just for the coming year. Thanks for putting that in there. I think it is a really important part of how we have this conversation better with our boards. And it leads to, I think, better, if we don't have to be so distracted about justifying 1 year at a time, it allows us to do better long-term sustainable planning for organizations too. Because honestly, by the time we get the budget out, the next 12 months, most of you in leadership positions are already thinking about year 2 and 3. It just isn't on paper yet. So it really syncs up the story there. Anyone else? Great stuff. Cool. Okay, we'll move on. You're welcome to chime in if you'd like to. And so this brings us to our first secret tip of the day. I wish I could have put some cool music in there, like we're spies, but it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. But my secret tip of the day is words before numbers and conversations before calculations. And this is partly why I really like the budget process, because I do love numbers, but I really like talking with people too. And this planning process is really about conversations about how things move forward, and not so much about how how the numbers look necessarily. And so many of us have been trained to start on the budget with a big old Excel spreadsheet or a whole pile of financial statements from the prior year. And relate to that process. It's like this endless stream of numbers without context. So even if we have the coolest budgeting tool in the world, which I mean, I'm not even sure exists, our budgeting process that starts with numbers may not be a fulfilling process for it. So today we're talking differently about budgeting, where we start with conversation and ideas and goals. And we're going to look at also how participatory planning can give us an even better plan during the best times and in the hardest of times. Okay, so, all right, so I gave you the secret tip. Now I have to share the brutal truth with you. And the brutal truth about planning is that our plan will almost always be wrong as soon as the printer ink dries. This is true and we know it. Things change. We plan with a certain idea in mind, and before we've presented it to the board, we've already learned something completely different about the following year. Getting clear about our assumptions is key to weathering change, and I feel like we've already hit on that. So because those budgets are fairly fragile and tenuous, the story is something that stays or can be added on to in a much more effective way. So if your staff and board hear that headline story, but some of the numbers have to change, you can pull them along that story journey with you, because you can tell them how the stories change and not just dive right into the this number's 4% higher and this one's 10% higher now. And so when we're thinking about, hey, how do we set out about doing this kind of big picture thinking when we're starting our planning process, I put together a tool that will help maybe spark some thinking. Oh, and I wanted one comment that came through too about big stories. Diversifying funding sources is becoming important to me too. Thanks, Sammy. I didn't want to miss that one. I think a lot of folks think that. Okay, here we go, planning tool. Oops, I didn't do it right. So bear with me. I have to go find my, oh, there they are. My disappearing, there we go. Cool. Okay, so now you should be seeing an Excel spreadsheet with some pretty colors on it, because nothing makes an Excel spreadsheet better than a couple pretty colors on it. Highly recommend it. Are you seeing the pretty colors? Yes. Cool. Okay, so this context, obviously there's numbers here. Okay, sometimes there has to be numbers in budgeting, but the idea of this is sort of context setting for your planning process. And you might start gathering this information by yourself, with your leadership team, with your board, with your entire staff. You have really a lot of options about how to start it. The first thing that I would do is, really figuring out where are we and where have we been from a financial perspective. And so at a high level, not, diving into the details yet, I would grab a few key numbers from the organization. And this is going to look different based on what is in your headline story. So if you have some big funding challenges or funding good news or funding pressures, I would definitely pull a couple of years of funding by whatever category is relevant to the organization. And I just like to put in percent increase and decrease. So I've got a couple of years here, 3 years, some percentage changes, because I just love comparisons. And this is just going to give me kind of first of all, I can start telling myself the story for the last 3 years. In this case, the story I made up in my head when I wrote these in was oh, we got a bunch of funding. The next year we spent the funding. We didn't necessarily get a whole bunch of new funding. And then the next year we got some more funding. So that's my story. And then other expenses or whatever is relevant. I do recommend incorporating non-financial numbers into your high-level budget planning, because that helps deepen that story. We've been growing. When you can actually see the numbers come through, whether that's your net income or how much cash we've been building, or some of these other metrics I'll take a look at, can really help flesh out that story and support that story. So some financial metrics: basic revenue, expenses, the net income difference, the change, this is the bottom line part, that the board will be focused on and you're likely focused on as well. And then cash too, because one of the things, particularly in the last few years, that we really have been seeing with some of the CARES Act funding and some of the sort of fast moving pandemic money is that some organizations really have been able to build some cash. You know, we got more money than we could spend in a short period of time. We can stretch that money out a little bit longer, not CARES Act, which had to be spent, but some of the other private foundation money. So looking at your net income is one story, but looking at your cash is always a slightly different story, sometimes a better story where we are right now, sometimes a harder story. So I recommend pulling that number too. And then also looking at things like how many people we served or how many programs we had, and then the cost for that outcome. I think cost per outcome is one of those yellow flag metrics to me. It can be really hard to equate the services we provide for folks to a dollar value. And so there's a lot of sensitivity about that metric. It is good, you know, so you have to decide, is that going to be useful in our organization? Is it just something that I want to know? You know, when I was the CFO at Fair Start for a number of years, and we looked at the cost per outcome, and we used it only in certain circles for sure, because we did not want to dehumanize people into money. But we used that intentionally to look at the cost per outcome and how it changed, whether it was higher or lower. Not with judgment. We worked really hard on this, not with judgment, but with just explanation and curiosity. So when cost per outcome was really going up, was it intentional? Yeah, it was, because we added a bunch of wraparound services and addiction services. So we could be really proud of that increase in cost per outcome and feel like such a worry, like if we put it out there, the board's going to be like, do it for cheaper. So cost per outcome in a way that you feel comfortable with. And then head count too is a really important, I bet almost everybody on this call's number one budget expense item is people. The work we do is so reliant on people, obviously. And so that should be a component in the budget beyond just relating to salaries, is this burgeoning number that's getting out of control, where people feel pressured to tell us not to spend so much. And so really relating the salary to the number of people we have, looking at things like average salary. Maybe it makes sense to look at benefits specifically if you're really trying to support staff better, but really making these kinds of metrics part of the budget conversation too humanizes it and also really connects to your purpose. So getting some numbers together, give some context for the story, and then the words part, the conversation part, is really, this is where you can kind of write your big story. So putting in writing what your assumptions are for the next year. And this is something I just, even in the world of accounting, I train and every accountant I've ever worked on, and I was trained myself in this, like, state your assumptions, because back to that brutal truth that this is going to be wrong, right? That's all we know. Whatever number it happens next year, it probably won't be the one we put down on paper. So being clear about how we made the decisions we made is one way that we just reassure ourselves and folks who've been involved in the process that, like, we are guessing, we are making our best guesses, and we used these facts to make those guesses. So then 3 months into the year, if something really radically changes, you can go back to your assumptions and say, hey, you know what? We made this plan based on this idea that we were going to double in size. And that was based on an assumption that people would show up to be served. And it turns out people haven't showed up to be served. And so one of our assumptions didn't come true. And that means that the underlying plan that supported that is also not likely to be valid anymore. So it can be a better way to bring boards and people through that conversation about when things change. So things that you might consider, again, this would just be totally for your own organization, but one of the first things I like to understand when I'm coming into organizations is, are you growing? Are you, like, stabilizing the work you're already doing? Are you shrinking or cutting stuff out? And almost everybody is growing, but it's still really important to acknowledge that. Strategic priorities. So that might tie back to, like, strategic plans that the board's familiar with. It might, a lot of us do like 3 or 5 year strategic plans. And so this is a way to say, hey, yeah, we've got this 5-year goal to do this, but what's relative for the next year is A, B, and C. And then, excuse me, changing circumstances. So, are we moving or going virtual? how are external factors going to impact our costs? Pandemic, inflation, supply chain, all of us are trying to figure that out. So changing circumstances doesn't have to be the answers. It can just be the questions. Here's where the uncertainty in our plan is. Oh, and then I made a separate section for uncertainties because I really want to double underline that. It is an art to do planning and budgeting. It's never exactly right. Things always change. And then you might even be driven to do some contingency plans. So particularly for like a new organization or an organization that's making a pretty drastic change in direction. Hey, we've made these assumptions. We're going to make a plan based on A, but you know what? I also want to bring a plan based on B, and I might even bring a plan based on C. And those don't have to be down to the detail budgets, right? These might be very high level guesses at B and C, but another way to sort of manage uncertainty. Just come up with different scenarios. Probably won't hit on all of them, but it's great to be thinking about like, how might I shrink in a moment or how might I grow in a moment? All right. That's that tool. You'll get a copy of it in Excel and also PDF. And I'm going to go back to my other screen. Well, I think actually
Can I
go ahead.
interrupt for a second?
Yes,
Do we
please.
want to pause and see if folks have any quick questions or reactions to
Yes.
the tool?
Yes. Yes. Thanks. Yes.
Folks, reactions, thoughts, questions? I know that it was a lot and it's quite, I mean, there's probably some things that are similar to the ways that you budget now, but just even the fact that it is multi-year and it is looking at our work from different angles. I mean, I'm really curious to kind of hear how it's landing for folks.
Great. I like this. So I like it. It's amazing. I'm going to read those out loud. I love the part about assumptions. Oh, go ahead. Was someone speaking?
Yes, this is Tasha from Juice 180.
Hi.
And hello there. When you're building the budget, so this is beautiful. I love the way this looks. What is the like, who's the audience for this? Or is this an example of what the budget can look like? And I also want to state that I love that the assumptions are right here, which is why I'm asking, because that for me, when I'm looking at a budget, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, you know, all the information's right there. So who's the audience for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think this can have a lot of audiences. So this is, I think the process of pulling this together, and some of those are going to be, you know, some of that's historic data, maybe it's future data. I think this is a tool that's probably owned by the person who is the visionary charge for the budget process. So the process of gathering it, I think, creates audience, right? I think this is something that you could use with leadership. I think you could use it with staff. I think you definitely have this as the top sheet of your budget after it's all said and done, right? Because this can help. I mean, I would even put, you know, you send your budget to funders as a PDF, like put this on the top there too, right? If I think you can tune it to whatever audience you want. I think it's this, when we talk a little bit more about boards, you know, boards don't love budgets and finance either, but it's one of their chief governance charges. And so the easier that we can make the conversation with the board, and again, like, you know, colors and words are much easier entrances into the conversation for them. So yeah, I think definitely a board for sure.
Okay, thank you.
We've got a hand from Rebecca, Amy.
Yes, Rebecca.
I just like how easy it is to read, and everything that you might question about a budget, almost everything is kind of in this page here. So anyone that would go and read the budget that kind of like has like a understanding of budgets that might have a question can go to this page and be like, oh, okay, that's why they did that. So I really like that, because sometimes I'll get like random questions I didn't think to ask earlier, and I would be able to probably go to here and get some of that information.
Cool.
No, I'm telling you, the assumptions, and Rebecca and I work together, so sorry, I feel like I can jump in here, but the assumptions and the contingency plans for me is a game changer. That's absolutely how I want to approach our budget in this coming year. So thank you for that.
Awesome. That's great. Any other questions or thoughts about how this could be a better tool? Cool. Okay, well, my next slide, which I'm going to find, is really just asking Jamae to hop in. But let me pull it up. And oh, yeah, there it is. Really? Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry, I talked to myself out loud. Okay, yes, stories from the field. And Jamae, would love to have you tell us a little bit about, I think that you took over at Feast like pretty much right before the pandemic, if I'm not mistaken, and that was a time of great uncertainty. And you've done such a fantastic job managing through that uncertainty. And I know it's been challenging at times too. So whatever you feel like sharing around that, we would love to hear. Take it away, Jamae.
Thanks, Amy. Yes, I have been executive director of Feast for a little over 2.5 years now. So I started just about 4 months or so, 4 or 5 months or so before the pandemic. And I inherited a wonderful organization. We had some money in reserves and, some financial stability, but there was definitely room for growth. And so I came in kind of having some goals that the board and I both shared around pay equity, being able to increase our staff salaries, not just to a livable wage, but elevating that to thinking about what does a thriving wage for our staff look like, so that we can both compensate them what they deserve and what they earn, and also retain them for the future, because we invest so much in training all of our incredible youth workers that we want to keep them for a longer time. And so a couple of the conditions going into the pandemic was that Feast was already deeply rooted in the community. And so we were uniquely positioned to kind of pivot and meet some of the needs of BIPOC youth during the pandemic. And I think because the pandemic really showcased the need for an organization like ours, we experienced significant financial growth from the beginning of the pandemic moving forward, both from emergency COVID funds to individual giving. Across the board, we saw our budget grow pretty rapidly. But the question on my mind was, is this going to continue? Is this going to be sustainable, or is this a cliff that we're going to fall off at some point? How long can I expect for donations to be coming to us this way? And also, Feast is an organization that is meant to grow by design. We have shifted into community organizing. We are seeking to build a base of students across 5 different schools right now and hoping to expand to more schools in the future. And so as we build our campaigns, we're meant to grow and invite more people in. And as we invite more people in to work on these campaigns, we also need to compensate them well, including our youth. So for example, we increased the number of youth in our program from 26 to 32 to now 40. And all of those young people are paid approximately $25 an hour to be working on these campaigns. And so there's a cost in itself. Our growth means more compensation. And along with having more youth to compensate means we need more staff who are able to work to support those youth. People are absolutely our greatest asset. And like Amy mentioned before, also our greatest expense in the organization. So with the goals of pay equity and growth in individual giving was another goal that we had in mind, and also growing our staff capacity. We were just still facing a lot of questions and uncertainties. So we were wondering, we're facing a funding cliff in 2022, like many of us that are probably applying for some big government grants right now and needing to reapply. And we were also, during this time, have shifted our mission. We have a new mission that has shifted us from youth development into youth organizing. So that puts us kind of in another category of funder, or prospecting, looking for a new type of funder that wants to fund more youth organizing when there's much more funding for direct services. So some of the questions that I was asking myself and discussing a lot in coaching was, I need more staff capacity to meet the momentum of our growing campaigns, but is now even a good time to hire? How much will Feast grow, or does Feast need to grow to meet the community demand? And what does the timeline of that growth look like? What will the cost of that growth be year over year? A term we had talked about with our board was, do we want to be ambitious, or do we want to be like cautiously ambitious with how we're thinking about investing our money into our goals, like pay equity. And how well are we doing at diversifying our funding sources, and where do we want to get to in the future? So looking at something like pay equity in particular, that was probably one of the biggest drivers of our budget conversation. I started out with a Excel spreadsheet with many tabs. That was very helpful, but it only looked at 1 year. And so I was looking from 1 year to the next, like what funding do we have available? What level of risk am I comfortable taking at this time? Because it's a risk not to act quickly, and it's a risk to act quickly. So kind of need to manage that. And one of the best ways for, in my opinion, to do that is to look at the data. And so I started taking small incremental steps towards pay equity and smaller raises for the staff. And then as we increased our financial stability, I really went to the board and said, hey, I really feel that it's time to kind of take a larger leap towards our goal of pay equity. And I believe that we have the funding to do it now. But their question was, what is that going to look like in the future? What is that going to look like 3 years ahead, 5 years ahead, if we're growing all staff in this way and hoping to add new staff members? So I was able to be connected with Amy, and Amy's wonderful colleague slash sister, who like designed the most incredible budget tool for us ever. I got to literally talk through all of the challenges and questions and things that I'd been experiencing to kind of customize this tool to be able to really quickly look at, if I increase staff salaries by 5% today, and then 5% next year, and 5% the year after that, how much will that impact our finances, or what will we need to invest? Or the tool can also show me the mix of our funding currently, and we can prospect goals of where we would like to increase funding. That can tell me, how much more would we need to raise to meet particular goals. And I will say that having this tool really helped advance the conversation with the board, starting with our monthly finance committee. That's kind of the main driver of like Feast Board's finance. We looked over this tool together, and I took their questions and was able to use this tool and pinpoint areas that could kind of demonstrate and answer their questions. So for example, when I started at Feast, the starting salary for an employee was $47,000. Because of being able to show this tool and the impact of increasing salaries now and versus what we had done, we've been able to raise our starting salary to $60,000, which feels like a great accomplishment for us. We're trying to move towards the goal of 70,000, and we're almost there with all staff. And I can look right in my budget tool and tell you that by the end of next year, we will be there with most staff already over that threshold because of the incremental changes we took. But for example, in the first 2 years, I was kind of going by cost of living or percentages and taking more cautious risk and raising salaries anywhere between like 4 and 6 or 4 and 8%. But by being able to look at what we were able to invest, see what the long-term implications would be, we raised staff salaries this last year, most of them at 25%, to take a much significant leap towards our goal and really living into our values. And what I can tell you about how that has impacted our staff is that they say it has literally changed their lives. It literally makes it more feasible to live in this area and in this region and do this work in the communities that we work in. Our staff should be just as cared for as we want our community to be just as cared for. And so this really helped make that vision and value an easier conversation and vote when it came time to pass the budget. It gives me so much more peace of mind, and to be able to see like, okay, what if I don't get this or that grant back? Then what happens? Like, to be able to kind of make contingency plans based on being able to have assumptions or test different scenarios with this budget tool. And I haven't even been able to dig into all that it is capable yet. But kind of a next step for us is using the budget tool, as well as setting up some dashboards that can help me really quickly get snapshots of like, where are we at with growing our individual giving right now? Or there are 3 more schools that want to work with us right now than we may even have capacity for. How much is the cost per school to be able to grow into 1 school, let alone 3 schools? And so this is the way that tool can help me make some of those programmatic decisions as well. I said a lot of things. Amy, are there other things you want me to speak to, or I would be happy to answer questions? Or
I mean, you're getting a lot of love for this, that it's a great story. It's resonating with people. There were so many hearts while you were speaking. So
thanks,
love-
y'all.
Thanks for sharing. Do folks have, I mean, definitely let's open it up for questions. And I have some observations I just want to double underline. 2, you know, while people are thinking of their questions, Jamae, one of the things I think is so impressive about that whole process is, you know, when I look at it from over here, right, with a little bit of distance, one of the things that I notice is that, particularly because it's about pay equity, you know, and when we're talking about finance and budgeting, I'm very joyful and jokey about it, but it seriously is one of the ways that the nonprofit industrial complex continues to starve our employees of fair wages and our organizations of the resources that we need to do the work we do effectively without burning out and breaking down. So when we, and our board, and frankly, board governance structure in itself is a fairly archaic management style for our nonprofits. And, you know, the power differential is really challenging. So here's Jamae in the middle of a pandemic, you know, fairly new executive director, and also dealing with one of the probably most charged issues, because how easy is it for boards to say, you know, you hear it, even though Jamae's board's amazing, but they've been trained in how to be boards. And so one of their first instincts is like, how is this sustainable over the long term? Which I think is a really great question. But what we know is that it's also charged with, I would like to say no to you. And I imagine you haven't thought this through. I don't feel like we can afford this, right? That's sort of the subtext. It's like, there's so many big, important questions that are core to our values. They're core to why we're doing the work we're doing, that are actually part of this budgeting planning process. So it's like, it's no wonder that when we put a spreadsheet in front of other people who are taking part in this conversation, that they just go to sleep because like, we're really trying to get at the root of stuff. Anyway, but I just love the way Jamae navigated through this conversation, and also met people where they were at, right? Which was the board saying, how is it sustainable? Like, well, let's build them a model and show them how it's sustainable. And that was really fun to partner with them on, for sure.
I want to give another plug for this. What this tool has done is not only enhance our conversations and our long-term planning, and we're in the midst of finalizing our strategic plan right now. So it's so great to have this tool, but we have more interest of board members joining our finance committee now than we've ever had. And I swear showing this tool in this year's budget conversation was a real turning point, because now it's the most popular committee on our board, and we just had like 3 people want to join it, and it hasn't historically been, you know, the one that really excites everyone. But we have a lot of exciting conversations to have now. And I guess I'll say, for my own growth, something you said earlier really resonated with me. Like, the budget isn't just a tool for governance. I actually started, and one of the first tasks I had to do was write the budget, because it was October. And I'm like, okay, well, here we go. This is the largest budget I've ever written. And I was kind of thinking of it as kind of just that governance tool. I wasn't sure exactly how the budget was going to help me make decisions, other than, you know, keeping spending and income in check. But now with this tool and how many of the assumptions going into it, I can see them, how they're playing out. I actually see how the tool is both helping me articulate and communicate what the goals of the organization are, and that you're really telling the story of your organization and what you're investing in and where your strengths and where your growth is through this tool. It's not just something to look at once, and yes, it absolutely changes. Like the second you input one thing, you get another grant, and then you're like, okay, now I gotta change it up. Like that's a continual process. But this year has been particularly illuminating about how the budget tells the story, about how I can keep us accountable to our goals and track our goals by using this tool.
Thank you, Janae. That's so cool. Any other questions or comments? We've talked a lot about the tool, and I regret that I haven't thought about actually bringing up the tool to show people. It's just so specific to these. But hopefully the summary tool, I do have it if people want to see it, and we can certainly talk about that more. Someone's got a question here. Do you think planning in 3 or 5 year increments and budgeting accordingly is the best way to be sustainable as a nonprofit or a CBO? Yeah, I think so. I think long-term planning and thinking is really good for long-term sustainability. I think that the annual budget process and then the 3 to 5 year strategic planning process is like fraught with challenges. And so, yeah, I totally think, organizations can tick all those boxes and still fail in the long term because there's so much nonprofit industrial complex thinking built into those processes, right? Which is like, we have to prove it before we can do it. And we're not allowed to like invest up in order to do things. And, so that's a lot embedded in the language around that. So I think long-term planning and conversations are really important. And I think the more, what I have discovered in nonprofit sector is that a lot of us haven't been trained in budget and finance stuff. Many of us have been taught all our life that that's not a place for us. Math, numbers, business, banks, money stuff. And so what I think does make for good long-term sustainable organizations is when leaders figure out how to think about this stuff differently a little bit, and tie it to the values. Like Jemaine's story is so incredible, right? Because her budget and her long-term planning, they are simply tools for the implementation of the vision that is aligned with what's important to Feast and Jemaine's particular values that she brings to the conversation around pay equity. And so that's when I think yes, as when we are driving that with our values, those two, strategic planning, long-term planning, and annual budgeting, can get us there. I come from, in the for-profit sector, that's where I, cut my teeth. They're constantly doing this trailing 12-month analysis, next 12-month analysis. Nobody cares when the end of their budget year is. They don't have this conversation built with funders where you have to know exactly what's going to happen over a specific 12-month period and you're not looking at anything else. It is a normal part of business finance to be doing rolling year forecasts and multiple year budgets and planning. But that's just not built into the way we've done things. So that's a very long answer to a very simple question. Any other questions? Cool. All right, I'm gonna bring back PowerPoint land. Oops. Go. Share. Okay. Great. Thanks so much again, Jemaine, for sharing, and we'll hear more from Jemaine in a little bit. So let's do another chat, or people can pipe in, as we're going to shift a little bit and start talking about particularly would love to share some stories about how we talked to our board. I think Jamae talked a lot about how they brought those big conversations into that board space, and would love to hear from you folks about what some tools or practices that you've used in times of uncertainty in both planning and talking with your board. Anyone want to share? It's very quiet. No one wants to talk about those hard board
It
conversations.
helps get us brainstorming. I mentioned our monthly finance committee, and those are the people who are most in-depth reviewing everything. And so to get really clear on goals with them and to answer their questions well and kind of get on the same page, then they are able to be strong advocates for the budget that I wrote when it comes time to go to the larger board and actually get the budget passed. So I think that, like, you know, working with your key finance folks, especially your treasurer and other folks who maybe have this background or interest on your board, to be able to get their support and kind of helping present and helping advocate for the plan that you're laying forward has been very helpful for me. And overall, we have like an awesome, incredible board that very much backs like our staff and the things we want to do. So that also helps.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. Someone also mentioned using a metric of months of cash on hand. I think relating the data to what the board is curious about is a great way to bring the board along on the path too. Who else has some thoughts about how those conversations can go?
I can just share a little bit from my own experience, Amy. I'll just say that, so some of you may know that I was formerly an executive director of the Nonprofit Assistance Center. And when I stepped in, the organization was still trying to recover from the Great Recession and was, dealing with debt, a number of just big financial challenges. And I think that, one, I wish I had had this tool, and I wish I had had Amy at the time to help us navigate through that. But some of the kind of tools and practices that I leaned on was, one, to what Jamae and Amy have both spoken about, just being willing to ask questions. I think that there's a lot of things in finance that can sometimes feel like another language. It's a specialized body of knowledge that can oftentimes be daunting and, purposefully, I think, has systemically been created to be hard to access and leverage in service of our communities. And so asking those questions, continuing to educate myself as much as I can and growing my own kind of financial literacy, but also really, using the tools and like the dashboards that we had to reflect the progress that we were making, even if it felt incremental, whether it was around the people that we were bringing on board, whether it was around the number of people we were serving, whether it was around how we were bringing the debt down, or, slowly starting to build up some reserves, whatever it was. Those things, I think, oftentimes help to draw the arc of the story that I was trying to share with our board, with our team, with our external stakeholders and partners, that even if, we're still digging out of the hole, and I mean, literally, it really felt like digging out of a hole. We were getting up there in the hole, like, you could start to see the daylight. And, those things I think were particularly helpful, along with, talking about contingencies, not operating out of fear, really operating from the perspective of, you know, what are our values? What goals are we trying to reach? Making decisions that align with that. But if something doesn't come through, then how will we adjust? You know, having that. And I think in our communities, you know, we're kind of experts at that anyway, in terms of coming from working class communities of color. You know, having those backups in our back pocket, while also still shooting for what it is that we know, you know, our communities, our families, our loved ones deserve. And so I just want to offer that up, because I think that a lot of what has been shared has really resonated with my own journey, and absolutely my, you know, continuing and ongoing learning. So thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. That's so right on the nose. Thanks so much for sharing that. In the chat, we've got our board recently asked to see our budget by program, so they could see what programs were fully funded and which ones they could help shout out to look for additional funding. I think that it's, you know, that balance between giving the board what they ask for and also not going through a process, you know, that sets you off course. Such an important balancing act, but true. You know, some of the things I think about that I've learned from the clients that I've worked with are that, you know, really starting with that big picture framework setting, which is like, hey, here's the story for this budget next year. That tool of talking through your assumptions is really that piece of like, this is the work we're planning on doing, and here's how we're planning on doing it. And it's based on a certain number of things coming true. And so really starting with that conversational level with your board of, you know, really laying out like, where is the strong parts of the budget and where are the parts that are where there's a little bit more uncertainty, where we're not relating that uncertainty to our own like lack of amazing skill set, right? No judgment, it's just true. We don't know if we're going to get that piece of funding. And then to the point of contingency plans, you know, that is a lot. When boards are, you know, I think boards are trained that this is an important part of their governance. And I think we were all trained that, you know, financial discipline is about spending less or saving a lot of money. You know, we have just a lot of internalized ideas about money that get in the way of having conversations about budgeting. And so our boards are often coming from a place of fear when they see a budget that's really ambitious or they see a deficit budget. So, you know, one of the things is to recognize that you're dealing with people who aren't in this work every day and are coming from a place of being scared. I know as the CFO, when I would deal with the Fair Start board, that was the first time I'd ever been in a board meeting. And one of my first meetings I had to present to the board, and I was absolutely terrified of them. And so when they would ask questions, because I'm a real sensitive numbers person, I would immediately take offense at any question they asked, and I could feel myself getting defensive. So for me, well, failing at that a lot, and then learning like, hey, if I just try to show up with compassion, I can get a lot further in these conversations. Just thinking about, you know, how can we address the emotional component of budget conversations that are hard in the room. And so that means, you know, just saying the same thing over and over again, making it really easy for people to understand, like checking our own anxiety when we're in that room where other people's anxiety is going to show up. Are all things I think about as really critical to those budget conversations, which brings me to my second secret tip, which might look a little bit familiar. It's the same one, is that with words before numbers and conversations before calculations, that when we're having tough conversations with our board, we really start with that conversation. We leave lots of space for it. We're in it every day. We got to bring them up the roller coaster and down the roller coaster and back up the roller coaster and get back to level ground. And so leaving the space and the time for that too is good. Just going to do a quick time check. Okay, cool. So beyond the words component, other tools that we might use for talking about uncertainty with our boards are things like forecasting. So when I'm working with organizations on their financial sustainability, I actually recommend that they build forecasting into their annual process. and work with the board on understanding how that's going to show up. So that idea of like the budget's out of date the second the ink dries, you know, taking a point midway through the year or even before then and saying, you know, every year we're going to take a look at that budget and we're going to say, okay, well, we know some things now. So instead of me explaining the variance on this one line every month to you, I'm also going to present alongside the budget. It's not about redoing the budget, a forecast that actually is going to tell you what's actually going to happen. So budget, what we thought was going to happen, forecast, what is more likely to happen. You know, that's a negotiation with your board about whether they would accept a forecast that had a different bottom line or not. I know when I was working at Fair Start, we worked really hard to maintain the same bottom line when we reforecast or forecast. But it gave us an opportunity to have the real conversation about what's going on with the board and staff and leadership, rather than, you know, having to just explain over and over again why our magical predictions that we tried to figure out a year ago are not coming true line by line. So I really recommend forecasting as a way to sort of normalize the, okay, here's where we are now conversation. And many of you have already hit on this too. Multi-year planning is another way that we can have tough conversations with the board, so that if they are seeing a year where you're concerned, they're going to be concerned, showing that in context of a couple of other years where it's like, yep, this is an investing year. And then next year is the year where we're going to be building back towards sustainable. Or sometimes bringing last year in is so valuable. Like, hey, remember last year we got a ton of money and now we're going to be spending it. And that means we've got a deficit. So we look at a couple of years across, and that doesn't mean a detailed budget, you know, 2 years out, 3 years out, 4 years out, you know, we're just getting, it's a little bit blurrier and a little bit blurrier. So it doesn't make sense to start to do it at the same like ground level details we do in annual budget. But really like the tool that you saw, thinking about those like big categories. And that's what the model that we built for Feast was. The multi-year part is really just a series of assumptions. So it just took the big categories of revenue and expense and just built in some places for Jemay to put in, well, I think revenue is going to go up by this %. I think this grant's going to disappear and I want to get to these salary levels by here. So just with, you know, just thinking through like a few numbers that you want to change in those years out, how can you look at the impact to the bottom line and the impact to cash? And then the third is a concept of sort of budget amendments, which if anybody here works in state government agencies, they use the budget amendment process quite a bit, or the ones that I've worked with. And this is really great for a brand new organization. I was working with an organization that was really new, and they're really in this process where they're seeking funding. That's their big story. Like, we're trying to figure out how many people we can get to come to this great party and help this set of work move forward. And if we get the funding, it's going to look different, and it's going to look different for each piece, each yes we get through the next year. So this idea of like, well, here's our kind of baseline budget. We've got a Zoom account instead of office space and my salary. And then here's the other basics. And if you think about how you create the template for that, right? And the conversation follows, which is, you know, if we get this chunk of funding, it's going to mean these expenses in this work. And then if we get this chunk of funding, it's going to mean this. And so why don't we pass the base budget, and then as great news comes in or not great news comes in, I'm going to bring you a layover budget or an amendment to that budget. So we think of that as additive through the year. We ask for basically the permission to do that with the board up front, but really guide them towards the yes on that. So Jody, I know that's something you're saying, this is my life. That might be something you consider doing in your planning, is looking at that sort of additive budget, so that you don't feel like you have to predict something with no history or track record. And with, you know, their brand new relationships, it's very hard to predict, just letting yourself have that piece. Yeah, and then just, you know, really making sure that you are involving your board as much as possible in the entire conversation too, so that they're not surprised, you know, in a budget passing meeting. I think I hit on everything. Anyone want to share, now that we've kind of talked through some other tools, anyone else want to share what has worked great for their boards? Conversations? Always looking for new ideas. That's fine if we don't.
Sure, there might be an idea or two out there. That way we can give Amy a second to catch her breath, because she has definitely been downloading a lot of wisdom on all of us in this workshop.
And even if you have,
Nikki?
go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no. Please go ahead, Amy.
Oh, I was just gonna also, we're gonna actually have another chat opportunity after this too, but also if anybody is willing to share the challenges, the specific challenges they're having with their board or what they're worried about in their board conversation, I think that might also spark some of us to remember how we're totally nailing it with our board.
I can speak on challenge, maybe in a silver lining kind of way. I know for us, it's hard to reach our board, except for the executive director. So right now we're doing more of a forecast. Look to our budgeting only 1 year right now. And it's hard to really know what the board thinks on it. On our budget, I'm just realizing we don't really know what our board thinks. So I'm wondering if other people have ideas on how to start being able to capture that opinion or that information, or if other people have problems with that.
I can just say that my board is so new. They barely have their heads wrapped around what their job is too. And so I think being able, like, so we're back, I don't have an answer for you other than, I think, yeah, just trying to be really honest, like, and I'm the executive director, so I can sit with them and be like, what do you think, what's going on, which is different than it sounds like in your position. Yeah, and I think the other challenge for my organization is that we have a funding cliff coming right now, potentially in December, and I don't think they really have their heads wrapped around that yet. And so I'm looking at all the tools you're sharing right now as like, oh, this can help me tell the story in a way that it'll click for them that this is real and this is serious, and we need to kind of put our heads together on how we're going to address it. If things don't work out the way we hope they do. Like, we're very hopeful things will work out with one grant, but if they don't, what are we going to do? So, yeah, so I'm just really appreciative of this. Thank you for letting me soak all this wisdom up.
Any other, go ahead.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Lika, and I work with the Union Cultural Center. Really appreciating the space, Jimmy. That story was like so inspiring, especially around the values, I think, of holding that. And I don't have any wisdom to share about our board. And in fact, I feel like with our organization, so we are a cultural arts center, and our focal point has always been Capoeira Angola, which is an Afro-Brazilian martial art. And it's very lineage based. It's very oral tradition based. And something that we have always really found challenging with just the board, and Amy, I'm only saying this because earlier you had talked about how like boards are kind of built on this archaic idea. And something that we always find is like, there's always this kind of like conflicting kind of, I guess, approach to how boards are run and how we run as a community, being in this very Afro-based tradition, right? And so I guess my question, just as hopefully not a super side tangent, is just, I would love to know of any other resources or models that can be more community oriented, and where, I don't know, sometimes like our board is really our community of folks that we know for like 15, 20 years now because they believe in what we do, and we're all very close community and it feels like family. And we've always been very casual, but as we, like, our headline story is that we're growing, we're going to get into this new space. It's really amazing, and our programs are expanding. But a concern that has been brought up is how the board has the power to like basically kick out the executive director, but in a lineage based organization and an art form where that really is just not like that, just that wouldn't be the trajectory that we would ever see. It's just come up as like a conflict. So I'm really interested in other models of boards and just this idea of accountability and you know, structure and you know, functionality. So that's, I guess, my question or yeah, concern.
It's a great question. And I'm gonna, let's see, rely on the crowd a little bit here. Has anybody tried a really non-traditional board organization or governance model? Yeah. Love that somebody's exploring it now. Janae is exploring it now. Yeah, it's you know, I think pulling apart the compliance governance piece from the culture and identity as an organization piece is important. So what it would be very cool if someone out there would like just really distill what is the state law require, you know, just what is that? Like, what's the very least we could do to meet compliance requirements? And then how do we build? I know of an organization also that's not even calling the board anymore, finding that the language to be really limiting and archaic. And then really create an identity-based and values-based culture on the board and process. I think a lot of what we do, you know, when it comes to compliance, it's really like, you know, as a board member, you have this legal duty of care, duty of two other things I can't remember, but I don't believe it's written into Washington state law that organizations have to pass an annual budget or that organizations have to do strategic planning for sure. Obviously, everything's on the hook for the board, right? So they can decide to hire someone or not. Anyway, so I think we put a lot of that board stuff on that we don't need, that we could learn to take off too. Oh, this is so exciting. Cool. This is such a great question. I was totally on my mind now. I'm writing this down. We at Seattle U, we have a board governance class. Now I'm really curious if they bring equity conversations into board governance at all. Next mission. Okay.
Thank you.
And if I think of anything or run into anything as I ask, Lika, I will definitely circle back with you about that.
I have a thought. I've been doing a little bit of research into this because we're looking at how to transform our own board structure so that we have even more youth leadership at the executive strategic planning level. But then there's obviously some challenges with putting young people on boards or like giving them the risk of the financial responsibility of the organization that they may or may not be interested in even. And when really we just want them to be part of the strategic planning aspect. So we're looking at other models and how might we reevaluate our bylaws and our decision-making processes, knowing that when, you know, we amplify youth voice a lot and our board tends to go with like what the staff and the youth and things are saying, but that doesn't mean that they always have to or they always will. So like, how do we really kind of institutionalize that type of power sharing within the organization without like giving a bunch of risk or inserting people into roles that they aren't really ready for? And when Amy was talking about kind of like pulling apart the governance functions from like the cultural pieces that you're getting feedback from your board members about, we've looked at like minimally viable boards is like something where you just have just the core people who can serve those governance functions. And then maybe you have another type of structure where you can have those community members involved. You keep all of your kind of institutional memories, if you will. And then that also provides another way that you might be able to compensate those community members who are giving their time and energy and expertise to helping to grow your organization, because we can't compensate board members. But if you had a different structure, then maybe you would be able to compensate those people who are giving that expertise and then have those people who are just serving the functions.
Oof, that's exciting.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Cool. Minimally viable boards is my new favorite phrase. Awesome.
Basically, I'm like, yeah, it's like exploding your board.
Yeah, I know, I love it.
I'm not telling everybody to do it, but if you have some clear vision or values around power sharing, that there are other models out there, and I'm really curious about what they are, and I'm curious to be in conversation with other people who are also exploring that.
Really cool. Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Jemay. Okay. So we're gonna shift now from board. I mean, we were talking about the same thing this whole time. I'm sure you've noticed that, but we are going to shift a little bit and talk about the budget process and who gets to be involved and who is involved. And would love to hear, actually, and I need to just step away for 30-second period, but I would love to hear in the chat box or hear folks chat about who is taking part in your budget process now. And you can also talk about who specifically isn't that you would like to be, or what your plans are. I know some of you particularly are thinking about how to incorporate more folks in that process. So would love to have a little bit of a chat about that, and apologize, I just have to step away for 1 second.
Jody, those organizational partners that you mentioned in the chat, are those the coalition partners?
As of right now, it's the COO partners. So there's
got it.
they're just the organizations that are on the grant.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. I'm seeing staff or managers. Rows. Is that the same for most folks, that it's your staff, your board, maybe particularly the manager level of your staff? Sarah was talking about how you want all staff to be participating somehow and in ways that support transparency. wanting direct service program staff, but currently they have no training in this. I know I've heard that come up as a challenge before, trying to figure out how to get that involvement because they have such important perspective, but difficult when folks don't have some of the kind of budget fundamentals that make it easier to participate. And then staff and board, along with our accountants. Yep. And Rebecca, yeah, previously just our ED, but for 2022, our directors were encouraged to let the ED know of budget needs, and the budget was created with the director needs involved. I'd like everyone to be involved in the long run with proper training to have full transparency and understanding organization-wide. Yeah, definitely. It's really cool to watch the trajectory of a lot of your stories evolve though, right? Like even in just some of the sharing right now, like you're sharing some of how you're moving more towards what sounds like a more kind of inclusive, participatory process. Jemay put, it's great to have a finance and operations manager to help share budget info with staff. Smiley face. That smiley face might be directed towards me because Jemay and I had many conversations about the beauty of having a finance and operations person in-house. Sometimes when you get to a certain scale of kind of your organization and work, it can be hard sometimes to be contracting something to someone outside if you need more immediate like answers sometimes to the finance questions that you have, or you're just the ED doing all of the finance things along with the 10 million other things that you also have on your plate. So yeah, I highly encourage that to others as well, just as I encouraged it to Jemay, who so beautifully thought that through and manifested it.
Great point. Thanks for jumping in there, Sarah. Yeah, it's I'm going to move the slide forward. So it sounds like most folks I mean, I'm glad no one's saying it's just me because it's lonely work, you know, and I think that's a big step for some organizations when the ED's like, I do use somebody else. I bring in management now. I bring in someone from the board. I have a finance and operations person because they are big decisions and it's nice to have someone to talk things over with. I think, you know, talking about how do we make budgeting more participatory, you know, what I know about this community is that the principles of how our work is done guide, you know, can guide how we do our budgeting too. And that so often that participatory collaborative leadership styles are really at the core of what we're trying to do. I think Jemay and Beast are a great example of that. And so thinking through, you know, what is it that has our budgeting process not feel as participatory as we might like it if it were fully aligned with the way we want to do our work in the world? Thinking about what gets in the way, you know, one thing for sure is inaccessible language of budgets. There's just a lot of vocabulary in there. And I speak in accounting talk and don't even know it. And so the more we know income statements and talk about revenue and expenses, you know, we're leaving some of our staff for sure behind who've never had that be part of their world. So thinking about that, how do we make normalized language, and then how do we also create training for language and how the numbers work, the basics of the financial statement. It can feel, I think, overwhelming to transform the process because we don't have the time to do it. This is definitely one thing we all know from trying to shift how we do leadership differently, is that it does take time. It doesn't happen overnight. Budgeting and planning is the same way and can be part of that journey also. We know this from other places in our work too, that the more people that participate in decision making, the better our decisions will be for our whole community. And so making a commitment to incorporating more voices into budgeting is great. And I think I love what Rebecca said. I was actually thinking of Rebecca and Choose 180, recognizing that we want to have more people involved, but how do we do it well? And I think that's really key too. So let's take a look. I want to take a look at a couple of tools that are just ideas for, you know, involving more people in the budgeting process doesn't mean everyone has to get a separate spreadsheet and start putting numbers in. That's just not appropriate or effective or operationally possible in a lot of organizations, but there's other ways to bring people into that conversation, particularly if we're starting with the conversation and the ideas and then moving towards the numbers. So let me show you just a couple other little tools. Let's see. There it is. It's here and then it's gone. There it is. Okay. Tools for planning. And then, yeah, it's going to show whatever tab I'm on. Okay, great. So this one's probably familiar to any of you who've taken business class or done strategic planning, and it's called a SWOT analysis. It is an interesting way to bring people into the conversation. It's a pretty standard concept. It stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. For sure, those words could use a tune-up. And so I would invite you all to think of your own words for that. But the idea behind, if you haven't ever used a SWOT analysis, the idea behind it is to think about, hey, what's going to come up next year that's going to impact the work that we do. And, you know, one of the reasons we know we want to involve more folks in the conversation is that people working in direct service, people working sort of outside maybe the management level of the organization who are less likely to participate in the budget process actually have so much of the truth about how our work's going in the world in their hands every day. And so really centering those voices as part of the process can be, I think, is such a great way to do participatory budgeting, and also is a great way to get information that's vital to the ongoing sustainability of the org. So SWOT analysis looks at both internal factors and external factors. And it's really just, the structure is just a way of getting people to think about these things in different categories. So you can do this in any way that feels right for your organization. But the basic ideas are, for internal factors, thinking about where we are now and where we want to be, what are our strengths? So what are the resources, capabilities, skill sets, experience that we have that makes our organization great at what we do? And then the opposite side of that, weaknesses, not a word I love. Where are there absences of certain resources, absences of strengths or skill sets or experience or staff, or places that the organization needs work or has opportunity. And then the external factors, opportunities. So, what's going on in the world at large that's going to make our work more exciting, bigger, get resourced better. And then the flip side of that, the threats, also don't like that word. What's happening in the external environment that creates risks or potential problems for our work and our organization. And so, the pandemic would have been all over here in many different boxes. Staffing challenges now, pay inequity, these are all things that would fall in here for sure. And then, also really great opportunity for staff to add their piece to it. So this would be a great tool to use with groups, maybe like within departmental teams, and then department leads bring it back up. You could try it in like an all staff meeting, depending on how many people are in the room. I've used it before where we just like brainstorm, there's no wrong thing to put up there. Everyone writes their post-it notes and puts it in each of the boxes. And then we go through a ranking or a voting process where people look at everybody else's work and decide like, what are the most important things? And then those float back into the budget planning process to really identify where investments are that we need to make, or plans or assumptions or changes that have to happen. So this is a way for staff to participate in a budget conversation, in a guardrail setting conversation where you don't have to train anybody on how to use an Excel spreadsheet. It's really just getting folks to think. The next tool that I wanted to look at, this is a little bit more numbery, but this is a tool that I've used in the past at several organizations, and I would say this is like a risk tool. So the idea behind this tool, similar to the SWOT analysis, but more specifically related to what your goals are for the following year. So if you have gone through a planning process and you've got some goals that are going to be part of the budget for next year, I've used an example here of increasing our outcomes by 20%. And the idea behind this risk thinking is like, okay, well, if this is our goal, what is most likely to get in the way of our goal? And then this is where you would do that crowdsourcing piece. And you can do it with leadership, you could do it with the board, and you could do it with staff. It would really be interesting to see if there's consistency across those groups of people or how much it differed. So then folks involved in the conversation would identify here to just think of like what will get in our way. What are the biggest risks to us accomplishing our goals? Have we used SWOT or SOAR process by program development or looking at the org as a whole? So I think you could do it for both, for sure. I think, I've definitely done it in organizations at a department level that then kind of rolls up into a big org level one. I think, let me know if I did or didn't get that question. Okay, cool. This particular risk, this assessment is looking at like impact and likelihood. So you're assessing how big of an impact would it be if this thing happened on a scale of 1 to 5, and what's the likelihood of it happening. So things like, I mean, everyone always uses earthquake in business school. So if it were an earthquake, it would have an enormous impact, but its likelihood is fairly low. And multiplying these two, impact by likelihood, you get this risk score. So this is a great way to turn some subjective conversations into an objective assessment where, it's where every vote counts the same essentially. So, you might involve staff or bigger groups of people in developing the entire thing. You might identify the risks first and have them give input on impact and likelihood. Then you can add everyone's score together and rank this based on its risk score. Then the idea is you move then through this idea of like, okay, well then what are the actions that we can take to address these risks. So for lack of, staff leaving, staff turnover, not being able to rehire, then if that's the number one risk we have, it makes a lot of sense to really invest in staff salaries, training, other retention strategies. And then resources, like specifically, what's that going to cost us to do it? Like, okay, well, it's going to cost us a couple $100,000 next year. If that's really our biggest risk, that's where the money should go. This is a way to sort of march through that process of what could go right, what could go wrong, and really figure out a way to monetize it in the budget, tie it to that. Okay, any questions about those tools? They are. Everyone, so through the workshop registration, everyone will get these tools for sure. Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. Oh, good. I'm glad they might be useful to you. Okay, let's return. I think we're going to ask Jemay to talk to us again. Yeah, so some ideas for how you might involve folks. And I would love to ask Jemay to talk with us again. And Jemay, if you would share your experience with how you've engaged different folks in the planning process over time, or just speak in general about, I know you've already hit on it. And if you feel like you've already hit on it, you can just say that to Jemay. Take it away.
I think based on this conversation, I'm growing even more aspirations about how I would like to involve others in the planning. I would say at the beginning, it was mostly just me taking the information that I had available to me from the previous year and what I could expect coming, and pretty much me presenting it to the board. I would get feedback from our finance committee around bigger questions that I had, but by and large, it was me drafting the budget and then presenting that to the full board with support of the monthly finance committee. I have always had steps of asking. We have two directors at Feast. We have an organizing director and we have a development and operations director. And so I work with each one of them respectively on the one tab of their budget, one tab that is related to their budget. But that budget had many other moving parts, which was primarily just me thinking about that. So currently our directors still do weigh in. And I think there's a lot of movement happening with our programs that we need to continue to examine as they grow. But using this tool moving forward, I think I would like to start earlier discussions. And it seems now to be even more of an ongoing discussion and not just kind of at the later board meetings in the year, to have more ongoing discussion monthly about the budget and how we want to use this tool. And to be starting to project like what is an ideal mix that we would like to see for our funding sources and how long is it going to take us to get there with some of the different projections or prospecting that we're doing. I'm really grateful, and I mentioned this in the chat, one of the investments that we did make that was incredibly helpful to me was an operations and finance manager who's on the call. Hi, Cece. And so I will definitely be working more with Cece this year to draft the budget while I'm still the lead person responsible. I think it will be great to have Cece's assessment about where we've spent this year, where we've seen significant increases in our spending in certain categories. We're developing new programs, so inevitably we're going to have new budget categories in the next year, and some fell away because of programs we're not able to do, like the dinner program that was actually the start of Feast that we haven't been able to run throughout the pandemic. So to have a thought partner in the changing categories and how we're going to allocate different funds will be really helpful. And Cece's great at like helping me pull up quick data to make decisions or starting to turn data into dashboards that I can check more frequently to be able to make quicker decisions, to also see what kind of dashboards our board would like to look at. is something that we're also thinking about. So we're still kind of in process. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us right now, but I'm glad that it's shifting away from being a process where I largely sat with it and stressed about it and then tried to figure out how to present it. This year just felt light years away from that. And this is my third time creating the budget.
That's really cool. Thanks for sharing that. Great. Well, I can't believe we've spent 2 hours talking about this. Can you? Wow. Unbelievable. So I meant to stop earlier. So apologies. I just get ahead of myself and talk too much. Sarah, I'm going to put up the thank you screen, and I want to thank everyone for coming today. I want to thank Jemay particularly for coming and co-workshopping this with me and sharing so many really valuable stories of theirs. I know that this is, Jemay doesn't even know I put this up here, but I am going to Fresh Flavor in a couple weeks here. It's an event of feasts virtually. I cannot wait. Check it out if you want to support Jemay and Feast and learn more about that amazing organization. Thanks, Caroline, for your support through this. Thanks, Sarah, so much for always being here and being so fun to work with. And I'm going to turn it back over to y'all. I'll put up a reach out if you have questions screen. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Well, now that we are closing for today, we wanted to put up a quick poll just to get some immediate feedback from you all while it's still fresh about how this experience with this workshop has been for you. So if you could take a moment just to respond to these 4 questions, it would be super helpful to us. It allows us to figure out what's working, what would be more helpful, what changes, and what additional tools or resources would be helpful to you. So you just take a moment to respond. We would really appreciate it. It also allows me to help convince, all of our powers that be that that this was time and resource well spent. So please do chime in. And as folks are doing that, if you have any other suggestions on additional workshop topics or tools or resources or whatever it may be that would help to further your learning in this area and support your organization's work, please feel free to put that in the chat. It's so helpful to us. I mean, really, pretty much everything that we try to put out is in response to what you all tell us is what will be most helpful to you. Following the community's wisdom on that and honoring your expertise and your goals is what is most important to me. And so we would welcome any ideas and all ideas that you have. And with that, thank you so much for chiming in on that. And if you have any suggestions for things that we could improve or change, again, feel free to put that in the chat or feel free to email me. I'm going to put my email into the chat here as well so that you have it. And I just want to thank first and foremost Amy and Jemay for being just such incredible, inspiring, loving, funny, just the best people and brightest lights to be in the room with. And especially around a topic that oftentimes, like I spoke to before, doesn't feel that accessible and oftentimes doesn't feel that fun. And yet I had a lot of fun these past 2 hours. And I think that shows so much how much the people you work with and the energy that they bring and the wisdom and energy that you all bring really is at the core of what makes something feel like we belong, right? And that we can do it. And so I want to thank you for being a part of that and leading the way. I want to thank Caroline for all of the incredible support she always provides, not just during the event itself, but in the lead up, in evaluating the work that we're doing. Just in all the ways. She's just been such an incredible partner on our team. And then definitely not least, thank you to all of you. You are incredible. You are the reason that we continue to try to find the best ways we can to support you. We thank you for your brilliance. We thank you for your wisdom. We thank you for your humility and your openness and curiosity. And as was shared before, all the resources along with the recording of this workshop will be sent out. It might be Monday because we're getting near the end of the week, but it will get to you. And in addition to that, there is a finance helpline that Amy runs that we're piloting this year, which is an opportunity for you to reach out with a specific question or topic that you want to discuss and get some customized just thought partnership and consult on it. It's not it's not getting Amy to be your CFO, so just know that there are some parameters on it. But it is great for having one or a couple, shorter conversations about a specific issue or challenge or goal that you might be tackling right now. So I highly, highly encourage you to reach out because, there's only so much that we can tackle in 2 hours. The work is much bigger and ongoing and greater than all of that. And this is one small way that we're trying to continue to walk alongside you in the journey. And so with that, Lika, I see you're asking if it's open to everyone or only COO funded orgs. I think that right now, frankly, I cannot completely remember, but I think that we're doing it for COO funded and COO aligned orgs. I think we have room right now, Amy, is that true, to kind of open it up a little bit more? So yeah, let's, we'll have it open to both. Please don't post it on Craigslist. That would be different. That would be a wider net than we're trying to cast. But yes, folks who are doing this work in community in the areas that you all are working in, please share and know that you have my gratitude, each and every one of you. Thank you for inspiring me. Thank you for coming together on this rainy Thursday morning. And I hope you continue to be gentle with yourselves as we head into the end of the week. Treat yourselves well. And I'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.